even though we have the limiting factor of space. On the slide, you can see a list of things that will increase or decrease dry matter intake. Setting up your pens to ensure appropriate feed space if lambing indoors, or if lambing outdoors, ensuring adequate sward length and stocking density is vital to increase dry matter intake. As plainly put, if they can't get to the food or the food isn't there in the right manner, they're just not going to eat it. Heavily pregnant ewes take up more space than they would any other time of year, so this needs to be taken into account too. Once the ewe has lambed, the rumen isn't restricted by the fetus anymore, so the ewe's feed intake will increase dramatically, but so will her nutritional demand as she's lactating. So now we're going to try and go live for our first section, where Dan will discuss in more detail this topic with Ant the shepherd from Reeseheath.
Thank you, Hannah. I'm here with Anthony, who is Reeseheath's flock manager. We were having a debate on what terminology to use for it. We thought flock manager was the least offensive. I want to reiterate Hannah's thanks. This is really big at Reeseheath, really, opening themselves up for everyone to have a look round. Doing a farm walk is one thing, but having people remotely having a look when you can't share your thoughts is another thing. So we're really, really grateful for Anthony and the team at Reeseheath. So the first part of our assessment, as Hannah says, is dry matter intake. The absolutely crucial bit of any nutrition, any pre-lambing prep is dry matter intake, and that is a limiting factor. You'll have people who'll try and sell you things. I'm sure you have the same sort of thing, Anthony. People will come on, try and sell you all sorts of stuff. But unless you maximise dry matter intake, you're not going to get the benefit of that. So, Anthony, in this shed, who have we got? Who are our groups, and roughly how many do we have in each?
So, behind Dan, you've got the triplets, and you've got some sort of skinnier ewes, twins, sorry. There's about 100 in that pen there. On the other side here, we've got just triplets, and we've got about 8 or 9 quads this year, so they're mixed in there. And then at the far end pen, they're all separated off, there's about 56 singles in there. And then we have another shed that you guys can't see, and there's about 120 other twins in there.
Brilliant. Cheers, Anthony. So the first thing we do is we measure our pens and we have a look what our space allowance should be. So I don't know anyone watching, normally in an interactive session, we'd ask you, well, how much space do you think a ewe ought to have, a pregnant ewe? It's about 1.2, 1.4 metres square. So we can then measure our pens, and I would encourage you guys to do this at your place, or for one of us to come out and do a pre-lambing visit. We can work out what our space allowance is. Now, we've done the calculations, you have to take my word for it. There's enough room in all of these pens for 1.4 metres square for each one of these ewes. In fact, excess. So I'm sure that's stuff that you guys would have done. But that's really important to make sure that the environmental pathogen load isn't massive and they've got enough space to move around. So the next thing that's really important is barrier space. In an interactive session, we'd ask you, well, how much barrier space do you think? Any ideas, Anthony? I've put you on the spot. I wasn't going to ask you.
30 metres is our barrier, but
okay.
Yeah, and what do you think not 8 metres per ewes is?
Okay. So a metre would be grand, would be plenty. A lot of it depends on what you're feeding. If you're feeding silage at the barrier and then you're top dressing with concentrate twice a day, you need more room because they're all going to come and feed at once. And so you'd be on about 45, 50 centimetres a ewe. If you're feeding a TMR, and we'll get onto Reeseheath's ration later, then you can get away with a little bit less space, so 15 centimetres a ewe. But there's some really important caveats to that, and it sort of depends on what those ewes are going and eating. And when we look at the ration, we'll see why that isn't always as simple as it needs to be. So you can see here we've got good barrier access, but equally you can see if all of these ewes, and one of the groups at the far end tells us even better, we'll go and have a look at those hills later. If all of those ewes decide to eat at once, so when fresh feed's put out, we are going to struggle for barrier space. We can also see the construction of the barrier and whether we think that's impeding with dry matter intake. So there's some good information we can get there from looking. The second really crucial part is water and water access. Do we have enough water access, and what is the quality? So one thing we did before, you'll have to take my word for it, is we went and got a sample, and I would encourage all of you to do this. Go to your water troughs, get a sample, and would you drink that? I think I would drink that. I was being encouraged by Hannah earlier to down it pressure, which was a phrase I've never heard before related to pre-lambing visits. But Hannah assures me that's the way the kids are doing it, but we haven't downed it. But water is massively important. If we're feeding a heavy fibrous ration, it's a bit like asking you guys to eat a load of shredded wheat with no water. You wouldn't do it. So we need that. And also, Used milk is about 80% water, so we need a fair amount of water to make a fair amount of milk. And so if we're thinking about what our ewes are going to do after they lamb, then that's very, very important. And finally, there's some other points that we need to take into consideration when considering dry matter intake. And again, we would refer this to the group if we're in a room. Anthony, I'm going to put you on the spot. Other things that might affect dry matter intake, what do you reckon?
We still really crowding as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, crowding will definitely be. We'll see it up there. We'll try and show you guys later. What does that you do up there? The
one we've got more parts off the barrier, so you've got technical capacity space.
Yeah, so bullying is a massive one. And if people are lambing ewe lambs, they'll see benefit in housing those ewe lambs separately. Lameness is another one. Lame ewes will get up and eat less often. Fat ewes will eat less. Shearing can increase dry matter intake, and we've certainly discussed that in the past. It'd be interesting on the chat whether any of you guys are doing that. So there's quite a lot of other things that, and when we look at some lab results later on, we'll show you the effects of those things. So sometimes we spend a lot of money and a lot of time on planning a beautiful ration or buying some expensive concentrate, but unless we look at the basics of the environment and maximising dry matter intake, it's likely that you'll be wasting your money. So it's important that we look at these other things, and actually that costs you nothing to look at those. You don't need us out necessarily unless you want help, but you can measure your space, measure your barrier, you can look at your water, you can improve your water access, make sure you've got sound ewes or lane ewes housed separately, ewe lambs housed separately, do something with your bullies, so you've got all of these things that you can do. So purely from an environmental assessment, they're the basics. So we'll pass back to Hannah, and she can take you on to the next section.
To earlier, that was actually the bully sheep that's making the noise in the corner. But now we've had Dan and Anne talking about the feed space, we're going to move on to the actual ration that you're going to be putting in front of the ewes. So there are some basic rules that we like to implement around ration and feeding. Kind of some golden rules. A good diet has good forage as the foundation, with any concentrates and minerals as a nice complementary addition. They shouldn't be the majority nutrient source. And we don't want to be feeding any more than 0.5 kilograms of concentrates per ewe per feed, because if you feed loads of concentrate at once, you're at risk of causing upset to the rumen, like ruminal acidosis and pregnancy toxemia, which is something we want to avoid. A consistent routine of feeding at the same times of day is also key to reducing pregnancy toxemia, as well as avoiding hypocalcemia and helping to promote good rumen function. Trough space for water, as Dan mentioned, is also, water space is really vital, as Dan has mentioned, and it's often overlooked in terms of space and in cleanliness. So if you wouldn't drink it yourself, it probably isn't palatable for your sheep. And again, just to reiterate, the golden rule of trough space should be about 45 centimetres per ewe. But as Dan mentioned, if you're feeding a TMR, you can reduce it down. Bearing in mind the breed of your sheep as well, and if you've shorn or not for winter shearing. So when it comes to feeding the ewes, both over and under feeding them can cause issues. So it's important to work out your ration properly. Don't just rely on what you've done in previous years. So have a proper good look at it. Energy is, of course, the most important part of a ewe's diet and can be given as fibre, starch and sugar. A higher energy level is needed late in gestation for reasons we've mentioned earlier, namely the large amount of fetal development that is happening and the ewes also gearing up for lactation about now. Too little energy can lead to smaller, weaker lambs, poor udder development and also poor lactation, all things we're trying to avoid. Too much energy is basically wasted money and can also lead to some problems such as pregnancy toxemia and difficult lambings, again, things we want to avoid. Protein is also really important in the ration and comes in two forms: rumen degradable protein, or RDP, and digestible undegradable protein, which is DUP, which is also known as bypass protein. Rumen degradable protein is broken down in the rumen, and digestible undegradable protein bypasses the rumen untouched and is absorbed in the small intestine. So feeding a diet with sufficient DUP will contribute to good quality colostrum, which is really, really important. Also, around lambing, there is a dip in the ewe's immunity as the protein in her diet, which usually goes towards helping keep her immune system healthy, is now going towards producing milk. So feeding sufficient bypass protein helps minimize the STIP we see. And then just a quick question for you all to have a click. Do you actually get your silage analysed close to lambing? Oh, and we should have launched a poll, so if everyone can take a minute to have a click. Oh, it's about a 50-50 split. How about half of you voted? Just have a click. Okay, we'll just end the polling there. Polling, and share results. So there are your results. You can see what other attendees have put. So 42% do get their forage analysed near to lambing, and 58% don't. So all this stuff we've said so far is great in terms of feeding space, barrier space, and importance of there we go. Sorry about that. But to use this knowledge that we've learned so far, you've actually got to know what forage you've got to work with, and the best way to know that is to have it analysed, of course. And this is actually a copy of Reese Heath's grass silage analysis, so thanks to them for giving us a copy. When we look at silage analysis, we look at a few key areas. Obviously, we're not going to run through the whole analysis, but some really important ones are the dry matter, which tells us how wet or how dry the forage is. Extremes on either end aren't ideal, as a very dry ration isn't palatable, like shredded wheat, and wet forage is full of moisture, so the ewes have to eat a lot more of the wet forage to actually achieve the same dry matter intakes. Protein is the total nitrogen content of the food multiplied by a factor of 6.25, but this is a very rough measure of protein, as it can include residual fertilizer nitrogen and things like that. There's not a direct value of dietary protein available, but it is useful to guide your decisions in terms of extra supplementary feeding. And ME, or metabolizable energy, is the energy value in the silage available to the ewe after losses are accounted for. So the higher the value of ME, the more energy the silage contains. Yeah, and they're the key ones we look for. And we're now going to go back live to Dan and Ant.
Thank you, Hannah. So Hannah's talked there about some of the basics of feeding, and it's really important to get those right. So relating to the amount of concentrate you're feeding, and the real key bit that we try and get across to people is that concentrate is only going to make up for what you haven't got. It isn't going to make a bad forage good, and it shouldn't be used as a go-to area to make up for dry matter intake or to make up for poor forages. But the really crucial thing to know is what you're feeding. So unless you know how your forage analyzes and what you're feeding, you don't know where your concentrate fits in. And so that will be a really, really crucial bit. So Anthony, what have we got in the ration in front of these girls here?
So the ration in front of here, you're feeding about just under 5 kilograms fresh weight per head, and that's made up of about 3 kilograms of plant silage. There's a kilogram of clat base, and then there's about 0.4 kilograms of straw per head, and then our blend at the moment is 0.4 kilograms of blend per head. And the blend has been specified based on our analysis of our maize silage.
So you've got both of those analysed, and they're both plant silages.
Yeah,
and then you have the nice option of going through a feeder wagon.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So one of the points that Hannah made earlier on is that one thing that will increase dry matter intake is feeding a TMR. You can probably see how some of these girls are eating it behind us, and we'll touch on that in a minute. But one of the really crucial things to get across, it relates to a point that Hannah made, which is as ewes get more and more pregnant, they want to eat less and less, they need to eat more and more, and yet their rumen and their capacity for eating gets less and less. So down here, we've got a sample of ant silage. So this is Reese Heath clamp silage, and it's pretty good stuff. It's not mega rocket fuel, but it's 10 ME, so it's pretty nice on that front. 24% dry matter, so a nice silage. And you can do some really good, just basic assessments of how that looks, how you think it's going to feed, whether you believe the NIR analysis of that. But the key point here is we have 7 kilos, and that would be what is probably necessary for a ewe carrying twins, 70-kilo ewe carrying twins, to be eaten in the later stages of pregnancy. Now, Anthony, do you think your ewes would eat that quantity fresh weight of silage?
No, not close to that. Never managed to be able to eat that.
No, and it doesn't matter what you're doing with respect to feed barrier access, water, presentation. I'd be interested to know if anyone listening feels that they could get that into their sheep, but I think you're really going to struggle. So even with some decent, well-made clamp silage, we're going to need to supplement it. And what that does is it brings us onto there. So as Anthony said, the ration is calculated for just under 5 kilos, 4.8 kilos fresh weight of a mix. And you can suddenly see that we have a much more manageable amount there. And that is much more likely. But I think we would agree from the discussions we talked about earlier on, even that is a push. You've got to work to get them to eat that.
Yeah, we feed every day, so everything's always fresh. And
Okay.
we'll clear our barrier. We'll probably overfeed ever so slightly, so they've constantly got food.
Yeah.
And we'll clear it and feed straight again.
Yeah.
So the ewes never go without food at any point during the day in that 24-hour block.
And that's really crucial. And the point you make about feeding excess is really important as well. So if you're not feeding to excess, you won't be maximising dry matter intake. Whilst it might seem like wastage, if there's feed left over, then you're losing out on dry matter intake there. So there should really be 10% wastage, and it should be fresh in front of them. How often are you pushing up?
We probably push up every couple of hours, probably every 3 or 4 hours push up.
And it's worth noting, people think you have a lot of cheap labour in the form of students, but at the moment you don't have a lot of cheap labour. You're the only cheap labour at the moment. But it's that regular pushing up that does make a big difference.
Does make a big difference because you'll see the use they sort through it a bit as well, so they'll make holes. Because keeping it up there, they will go through tracks a lot better. You will increase your intakes by pushing up regular.
Yeah, well, what it does is it generates feeding activity and interest. Yeah. You do see it. But one thing I'd like to talk about is the concept of different rations. So the chap who puts the ration together for Reese Heath will formulate a ration based on what he knows of the analysis, and then he will present it to these guys who will mix a ration based on that. They'll feed it to the sheep, and then the sheep will eat a ration. So there's several different rations within that main ration. So simply because you have something written down on paper doesn't mean that you can necessarily assume that that is doing the job. And actually, when we talk about twin lamb and things, that's very important to remember. And what we can see, I don't know, Sarah, if you can pick this up quite nicely, that you particularly is demonstrating it. She is to a point as well. So these ewes are very, very adept, and we've got some over here, at sorting, brilliantly adept at sorting. So remember that we're working on a 15-centimetre feed barrier space for these girls, which you think, well, that makes sense. These girls are on ad-lib, TMR, ration, but actually the boss girls who come up at the beginning will get a different ration to the girls who come up later on. And they might be our late ones, they might be our thin ones, our young ones, or our higher risk ones. So we may have a ration that on paper looks brilliant, but actually we're getting twin lamb, we're getting problems that we're not aware of why we should be. And it's because these girls are eating different rations. And you can see it with the 2 black-headed ewes at the end there. They are brilliant at sorting. So one thing we can do to get around that is to come in and assess the ration at different times of the day. So let's start off with a pile of rations in the mixer, and then let's come back at 3 times throughout the day and get an idea of what we've got left over. Take a pile of ration and compare them. And actually, one thing would be really useful to do, we can do it in the future, is to do that. So 4 piles of ration along here and see how they're sorting it, because we'll probably find that those ewes, for example, are getting a much higher energy ration than some of our other ewes. And brilliantly on timing, we've got our big bully ewe who just comes over, dominates about 4 meters worth, and just sends everyone else off. So it's a really important point that you make. Say, well, why am I getting twin lamb problems? Why aren't my ewes performing? Why haven't I got colostrum quality that I expected? And it's those sorts of things. The other thing we've done at Reese Heath and we do at other farms is mineral sampling of the ewes. So we can help to steer our mineral supplementation by sampling the ewes to give ourselves enough time to do anything about it, but sampling the ewes, particularly for things like selenium, iodine, affecting cleansing and immunity and mastitis rates as a consequence, cobalt as well for lamb vitality. So there's lots of things we can do there, and we do that regularly, that sort of monitoring every season. I encourage you guys to get in touch about that type of thing as well. So to maximise the information, and then don't forget the basics. So hand you back. Yeah. Well, we've interested. I mean, this may be for another meeting about grassland and soils and things like that. It might overlap with the regenerative agriculture meeting, but we have found that we think our herbage out of grass is deficient, isn't it?
Yeah, we definitely.
And there's probably some lay manipulation we can do, some soil manipulation we can do to improve the state of the animals in terms of their mineral status. But unless we're testing, we're not going to. Right, we'll hand back over to Hannah in the studio for her next point.
Moving on to our next area to chat about is going to be our ewe assessment. So body condition scoring gets talked about a lot, and that's because monitoring your flock's condition is really important. But at this time of year, identification of your at-risk ewes is really important. And what we'd think of as an at-risk ewe will include your thin ewes that are carrying multiples or your fat ewes carrying singles, as both groups can carry different risks that you need to be aware of. Thin ewes carrying multiples will have a much smaller energy reserve compared to their energy demand, and are likely to struggle to produce enough quality colostrum and enough milk for their litter size. Fat ewes carrying singles will also be prone to growing big fetuses and also be a bit big themselves, so this combination can lead to difficult lambing, and no one needs that in their life. Both groups will be at risk of pregnancy toxemia, which can be fatal even if identified early. And this picture here is from AHDB. It's a similar resource as the picture from earlier. So if there's any students watching, I'd recommend using the AHDB website, looking at the Better Returns programme, because that's a good set of information for topics like this as well. And I'm just going to launch a poll, a second poll. How long do you think it takes for you to change a body condition score? Oh, close up. Oh, technical issue. Do you want to do the clicking? I'll just do that. No, sorry. We are having poll problems, but it doesn't really matter. Just have a bit of a think about how long you would think it would take to change a body condition score in your. Oh, no, guys, it's alright. It's just. How long do you think it takes to change a body condition score? Because changing a body condition score up or down by 1, it can take 6 to 8 weeks. So this close to lambing, we don't have time to manipulate the body condition scores of our ewes, and actually trying to manipulate them this close to lambing is pretty risky. A better approach going forward in future years would be to monitor your body condition scores at multiple points during the year, such as when you're weaning them, when you're scanning, or when you're vaccinating. Get your hand on your ewes and take a sample, or better yet, get your hand on every single ewe. And any ewes with scores that are either too high or too low for that time of year can be identified, and you can do something about it a lot sooner and handle them differently. So most of your flock are at a more suitable body condition score when they actually reach this time of year. Another thing we can do close to lambing is actually blood sample the ewes. You heard Dan and Ant talk about their nutrition and mineral blood sampling that can be done prior to lambing, but this is a different set of blood samples that we take 3-4 weeks prior to lambing. And the main things we will look for in those blood samples, so we look at urea, albumin and BHBs. So pregnancy toxemia is a complication of nutritional imbalance, and we use the BHBs to screen flocks for this. So we take a blood sample and look at the levels, and if BHB levels are elevated, this can warn us that the ewes are already in negative energy status. So attention can be taken to fix this. to try and help us avoid seeing any clinical signs of twin lamb disease. The bloods also show urea and albumin levels, which tell us about their protein intake. Albumin levels show us more longer-term protein intake levels. So if this is low, it could indicate more chronic undernutrition, chronically poor protein intake, or it could indicate diseases such as fluke or Johne's, which is worth knowing about. And urea will tell us more about our recent protein levels, so it can help us know how the ewes' intakes have been affected in later pregnancy. And low protein levels lead to poorer quality colostrum and a bigger periparturient immune deficiency in the ewes. And now I'll go back to Dan and Ant.
Thank you, Hannah. You'll have noticed my glamorous assistant is missing, although he could just arrive. He was getting a prop. So the next point, as Hannah discusses, is the ewe assessment. So we can do this at different points, but when we're specifically talking about pre-lambing visit, our mineral bloods, we would try and do those sort of 6 weeks of lambing to allow us time to manipulate those mineral statuses or to formulate a mineral pack or a supplement for us to add in or choose our bolus. And then we would do some blood samples a little bit closer. Now we'll concentrate a bit more on bloods in a minute, but Anthony's kindly got us some views out so we can sort of go through the basics of what we might be doing at this point pre-lambing. So we're not talking about our pre-service assessment or anything like that. We're talking about what we're going to do when we're a few weeks off lambing. So who have we got here?
So in here we've got a twin. You'll see she's got a blue rump, so she will help to a second service.
Yeah, so the thing that's important about Rees Heath, many of you will know this, but Rees Heath time their lambings on certain weekends to allow access to the public. So a good educational, informative weekend that has been scuppered in the last couple of years, unfortunately. But it does mean we synchronise these ewes. So we know when they're being served and when they're going to lamb. So we use cedars. So the prop that Anthony went to get was a cedar, for those who haven't used one, same as a Comcast sponge. Anthony, do you prefer them to sponge?
Yeah, I think they're a lot easier to apply. Yeah, when we took them out, they were used for a lot of sponges. They've come out easier, and sort of the heats were spot on. You know, when we took them out, we put the rams into serve. I think actually we served within 36 hours. So fantastic product. Worth the extra little bit of money to make the job a lot easier and a lot more reliable, shall we say?
And you guys use PMSG on with?
Yeah.
So we'd have our ewe in, so we know where she's come from, we know when she's expected. There's actually that group there behind us, so that's the bigger group with 90 odd ewes in there. Said, got added feed space and bedding space in there, but we want an idea of what she's doing condition score wise. This is quite good. We'll see if Anthony and I agree. We don't always. What do you reckon? Really? I was going to go 3. Okay. So there you go. So Auntie and I lasted a load of condition scoring and we were out by about half a condition score. Yeah. But the important thing with condition scoring is you get the same person doing it, do it all the time. So would you be fairly happy with her condition going into this sort of time pre-lambing?
Be the twin as well.
No, I think we perhaps not. That's a type of ewe. I mean, she's good, fit, healthy ewe. We wouldn't want her going too much thinner, so we can feel the spine there and we can feel the edge of her transverse processes, which are really important. But she's not lame. If she was lame or particularly thin, we'd put her in our TLC group. And
she's actually in here because she's lower condition than our regular twins as well. So she's really got a little bit more big space in here, whereas our other twins are a little bit more heavy, shall we say. So she's on a slightly better area, shall we say. So she's got better access to.
Brilliant.
For that reason, she's slightly lower.
So you'd think we'd plan that. We actually hadn't, but that's an interesting point to note. So there's a shed over there, which is a much deeper shed. And so our barrier space isn't quite, it still won't be compromised, but it won't be the same amount. And so Anthony's been through these conditions, scored them and brought her into our TLC group. Who do we have here?
So we've got triplet here. You'll see she's red bottom, so she's first service.
Yeah.
Just got a blue neck, so that means she's for our second weekend.
Okay.
So you just want to look at the other one there. She's going to be for the first weekend, triplet again.
our first service. So she's going to be a week later than that one there. Okay. So how are we finding her condition? What do you think?
Wow, based off my score, she's going to be a 4, but I reckon you're going to say 3.5.
I am. Yeah. You read my mind. But the good thing is, we can both agree that she is half a condition score, more condition than her. So you guys will have to take our word for this, but we've got quite a nice covering on the spine and the transverse processes there. And you can see the other point worthy of note now, we're close to Anthony's views, is the size of them. These are big views, and they should be capable of some big intakes, but we're not going to get sort of fresh weight intakes that would be necessary. And then this girl, interested to know what you think there. She's particularly lower. 2.5. Yeah, so Anthony's put at 2.5, and I might just put her on the lower side of 2.5. But again, so we've got from thinnest to far end, slightly bit more condition to nice condition there. But then again, she's in the group that come out of the group that's designed that exists to have greater space allowance, so a TLC group. Because we can't manipulate, as Hannah said, we can't manipulate condition score at this point. We'd be silly to. We'd end up putting all of that on the lambs with no benefit to the ewes, but we can manipulate access to feed. So we do that. And then the other thing is we still need to, as Hannah says again, make sure that their ration is adequately balanced for energy and for protein, particularly some high quality bypass protein later stages of colostrum. So whilst we can't manipulate them, we still know what we need to win. And if you've got a flock of 2.5, 2 condition score ewes, you know you're going to have to treat them differently to 3.5 condition score. So we'll go up to the bottom of the chart. We'll look at some blood sample results. So Hannah talked about the blood samples we conduct. These aren't from recent ewes, but they're ones we've done recently. So we look at urea, and we look at BHB, which is a ketone body. That is a measure of fat mobilization and excessive energy deficit, and urea is a measure of protein intake. So you can see here from our reference ranges, we're looking at 3, 4, and 8. And in this flock, we had 3 out of those 5 animals that were sampled that were low, but our BHBs are all normal. Now, I would sometimes worry if I was seeing a lot of BHBs that were less than 1.2 but sort of a little bit higher than these. So although we use 1.2 as a cutoff from the lab, I do think that sometimes if we're seeing a lot around 0.91, worry. But you can see from this set of results that this flock was fine for energy, but we were struggling for protein. And so when we analysed the ration that this guy was feeding, found out it did take a little bit of work to get the proper analysis out of the feed company, but the protein levels are high quality, particularly bypass protein levels were not high enough. And so we adjusted the ration, just looked at a different off-the-shelf nut, and managed to get his protein levels up. His colostrum quality was great. These were a flock of pedigree Suffolks, and so we had to make sure, particularly, that we were getting that right. And so we used these results to manipulate it, and we managed to avoid any problems. So we just get in there early enough, really. Not so early, can't tell if they're under pressure, but not so late. Cheers, Anthony. Thank you. Pass you back to Hannah, the final section.
I would like to take some of the credit for the success of the seeders, having worked with Ant to get that up and. Oh. Okay, so we've talked about our feed space and our dry matter intake. We've talked about our actual ration, and we've talked about how we've assessed our ewes. But now we're going to finish up with actually all this work goes into the end product, which is essentially the lambs, and the more lambs we have that survive, the better. So what affects the survival? Plainly put, lamb survival is a balancing act between challenge to the neonatal lamb and the resilience of the lamb itself. We are always aiming to tip the scales in favour of the lamb. Dan has just walked through the shed with some feed, so if the blasting is quite loud, I apologise. But yeah, we have the balancing act of the challenge to the lamb and the resilience of the lamb. We're aiming to tip the scales in favour of the lamb by decreasing the challenge and increasing its resilience. Challenge to the lambs includes disease challenge from the environment and also from the ewes if she hasn't been vaccinated for certain diseases. And bad weather is also a big challenge, as that never helps anyone. I don't think any of us appreciate being out in the snow or the cold. Helping lambs be resilient against the challenges they face as newborns includes achieving successful passive transfer of antibodies to help fight disease, good milk from the mothers for a good energy source, and also monitoring of the shed to make sure any lambs that aren't thriving are identified and helped as soon as possible, as a few hours makes a huge difference in many sick lamb cases. So, what actually causes losses in our lambs? A staggering 60% of all lamb losses happen in the first 14 days. The main reasons behind these losses are listed on the screen. Neonatal lambs are born with brown adipose fat, and this helps insulate them when faced with cold weather. However, this brown fat supply quickly decreases and replaced by normal white fat. Ewes with good nutrition in late gestation will actually increase the amount of brown fat that they put on their lambs, which will of course help more against hypothermia, which is one of the main causes of loss. Ewes managed better in late gestation will produce more quality milk and therefore provide a better nutrient source as the brown fat diminishes within the lambs anyway. Hypothermia and hypoglycemia, which is a lack of glucose, often go together, as any lamb over 5 hours old that is hypothermic should also be thought to be hypoglycemic, as the lamb's metabolism will be increased in response to being too cold, and therefore they use up more of their energy source, more of their glucose, and they're just tipped out of kilt and go hypoglycemic as well. This isn't helped by cold lambs having a poorer suck, and therefore cold lambs won't drink sufficient colostrum themselves and therefore miss out on the energy from the ewes, even if it is there. You also have exposure challenge and infectious diseases, which challenge lambs as well. However, you can help increase resilience to these infectious diseases by increasing the amount of good quality colostrum they get and the antibodies they're transferred. So let's have a look at colostrum success. As you can see on the slide, we actually have some photos of some colostrum samples we took from a flock, and you can see some actual results of the Brix refractometer that we will discuss on this next slide. So colostrum is liquid gold, and getting ewe nutrition right in late gestation will improve your quality and your quantity of your colostrum, and giving great colostrum is the thing that sets your lambs up for the best start in life. The two main benefits of colostrum is the immunoglobulins that they provide to the lamb and the energy to get the lamb going. The immunoglobulins help protect the lamb against disease, but these immunoglobulins can only be absorbed by the lamb in the first 24 hours of life, as after this point the lamb's gut has developed to a point where they can't absorb them anymore. This is why a key golden rule is every lamb should receive 100 mils per kilogram of colostrum in the first 4 hours of life, followed by another 100 mils per kilogram before it's 24 hours old. Achieving that first feed within 4 hours helps prevent the hypothermia and hypoglycemia complex that we've previously discussed, and absorption of immunoglobulins is highest in these first few hours anyway, so it's really important to get that first feed in ASAP. And also, knowing the quality of your colostrum is important. Despite good nutrition, some ewes will produce better quality colostrum than others, so you can use a Brix refractometer. That Dan has kindly stolen, so I can't explain it to you on this end of the shed. But you can use a Brix refractometer, and that's really helpful. It's a simple test, and you basically place 1 drop of milk or colostrum on your refractometer, and you literally look down the IPS3 result. It measures proteins, and these protein levels have been proven to correlate to the amount of immunoglobulins in the colostrum, and any colostrum with a score above 22% is good to go. It's good stuff. This is especially useful for you guys to know if you freeze your colostrum for any ewes that throw singles, or unfortunately possibly might throw a dead lamb, and you want to strip that ewe out and freeze the colostrum to use on any triplets. But if you check with your Brix refractometer and it's less than 22%, you have to think, is it worth freezing if it's not a good quality colostrum source? We can also screen the lambs up to a week after they were born to see if they've actually received enough of this good quality colostrum, because there's no point in having good colostrum if the lambs haven't actually drunk enough of it, especially if there's bigger litter sizes. This is done by taking a small blood sample from the lambs between 1 and 7 days old and measuring the protein levels in the blood, as this shows us if the lamb has actually absorbed the immunoglobulins it needs. If the result is below 5.5, we can class this as failure of passive transfer, basically meaning the lamb didn't either get enough of the quality colostrum soon enough and therefore its guts had stopped absorbing it, or the colostrum the lamb received wasn't of a high enough quality to help it get enough antibodies anyway. Having failure of passive transfer does put your lamb at risk, as they won't be able to fight diseases as well as it would do if it had enough immunoglobulins. However, both of these tests are retrospective. You can't improve colostrum the minute before it's needed, which is why nutritional planning weeks beforehand, which is why I'm having this talk, is key. You also can't boost a lamb's immunity once it has failed to take on enough immunoglobulins. You can't make it absorb more. But monitoring both of these parameters is really useful to help identify your lambs that could be at risk because they do have failure passive transfer, identifying your ewes that have produced poor quality colostrum to try and find out why, and it also helps identify any management changes you might need to make for future years ahead. And now we will head back to Dan and Ant for our final live section, and also followed shortly by our question section. So if you want to get thinking of your questions as well, that would be great.
Thank you, Hannah. Great. Nearly as good as the camera work. The children out there, we were really quite impressed with that. That was the last minute decision. So as Hannah said, the start of the lamb's life, which begins here, is crucial for that lamb's development. It's crucial for survival and ultimately, okay. Yeah, sorry about that, guys. So Anthony was just saying that they land where they are.
So we land where we are. If we've got them marked up, we'll allow them to have all their land in the pen where they are before we move. Ideally, that's within half an hour. Then we will move to a separate shed where we have individual pens, lime and straw for use with those pens. Ideally, we'll at that point go foster if we need to. Yeah.
And what's your approach to colostrum management in terms of them having it and your testing policy?
So we will leave the lambs to suckle naturally as they can. We will check the use the lamb every 20 minutes. If the lambs look like it's suckling after 40 minutes, we will then intervene. At that point, we'll strip some colostrum off the ewe, test that. If it's good enough quality, try and bottle feed.
Refractometer.
Yeah, use the refractometer. Check that. If the quality is good enough to feed the lamb, try and bottle feed. If it's unsuccessful, bottle feeding, then that would due. Yeah, if the colostrum wasn't good enough, we have some stored up normally in a bank, and we'll use that instead if you're desperate. Or if you just have enough colostrum itself, we'll substitute it somewhere else.
And are you using a colostrum replacer, or are you using colostrum harvested off the ewes, good quality, harvested in a clean way, and then stored? So really useful to use. I don't remember guys at the present health group a few years ago who got colostrum replacements and no replacement. However,
we actually have some cows as well. Okay, just in case you need. Okay, yeah, that's sort of the back.
Yeah, so totally your back stop. We talked a little bit years about roll the cow loss and risk of anemia. That's quite a small risk of dying. No cost from the risk. So I think you might have back stop there. For those of you who haven't seen, as Hannah just referred to, I stole the refractometer to get a bit of glory for it, but it is very simple. So a drop of colostrum goes on there. The beauty of the refractometer is that you don't need it to settle to room temperature or anything like that, as you do with a hydrometer, and you only need a tiny volume, whereas you need quite a lot more for a hydrometer. And then you look through it with light above, and you get a line inside that gives you quite a nice read, and it's fairly easy to read.
Oh, yeah.
And so Hannah says we're looking at 20%. And that is so important because all of these disease elements of these disease factors that we deal with are all a balancing act. And so it is our job to stack it in favour of the lamb and reduce the load on them from the environment. And so on this side, we need to look at ewe nutrition, ewe condition and colostrum administration. On this side, we need to look at environment. And so that is where our pre-lambing environment comes in. And if we weren't going to scare the ewes, we go there and do crawling around deeply. So you get in there, get at the floor, see how wet it is, down the bed it is. What we don't want to do is release those lambs into an environment already standing against the weevil cow.
We don't actually have that straw to the bed, Evan. Yeah. Cow. Yeah, so every 2 weeks on a road, cow.
And then the point worth noting again is you are lambing quite a high degree of scrutiny. And so I've been to the lambing weekend, lots of members of the public here with very standing, very interest, and the challenge part. This is where we're lambing. This is good. So I think if you press stand up that level of scrutiny. So we've got some results here. So these tell quite a nice story actually. We are in terms of data of what it tells us. We've got a load of lamb ewe identifications outside, sample identifications. We've then got what her lamb burden was, and what the lamb breed was, the ewe breed, age, and the lamb crops, what her colostrum results were, and then what the total protein of the lambs. And so, as Hannah referred to, we take a blood sample out of the lamb, we spin it down, and we measure again with the refractometer what the total protein is. The assumption or the science being the majority of that total protein, that immunoglobulins transferred. So we can see here we've got a variety of different breeds, a variety of different ages, and a variety of different lamb burdens. But when we come to this side, we can see there is quite a stark difference in terms of our colostrum result. Now remember, we want 22% or above. Now if we look at these colostrum results, we've got 30s, high 20s, again mid-20s. They are a phenomenal group of results. So that is fantastic. Then when we go a bit further down, we realise actually we've got some more questionable results. So we've got 19%, 21%. And then when we tolerate those colostrum results to what our total protein was, we can see that that relationship is true. So again, we were looking for levels over 5.5, very high levels there. We did have one here, 5.2. We wouldn't have known that to be the case if we hadn't bled it, but you're still giving this lamb a good start on the refractometer. Again, 5.8, 6, 6.2. So some brilliant results. This lamb died, and then we had one dead lamb, I think, born. But then when we look at our other results here, we have our lower protein results corresponding to our much lower colostrum results. So 4.8, 5.2, so both lower, and then one of our lambs died, born alive and died. Now this is even more interesting when you get into detail. These ewes down here are fairly high genetic merit. They are fed quite a complicated mixed ration with a lot of things going into it. These ewes up here, I wouldn't like to insult the owner of these and say they're lower genetic merit. I'm sure they're not, but they're, as we can see, a bit of a mixture. They're not fed shower, and they're fed a much more simple ration, so just forage with supplements. But what makes the difference here, nothing to do with the ration. If we're assessing the ration on paper, we never get to the bottom of it without doing a visit on farm. These guys are at a much higher stocking density with much more compromised barrier access, feed availability, water access. These guys are a much lower stocking density with better feed access, important when we're feeding concentrates twice a day. But you can see that actually the results are nothing to do with the expense of what's going into the ration. It's all to do with the details of how they're managed. And really, that was the point we wanted to get across to everyone tonight. Thanks to Anthony for allowing to do it on your plate. But it's not necessarily complicated. So we had a bit of losses there, so apologies for that. Essentially, we were just going over the point that without the detailed assessments, without coming down, looking at the lambing environment, nutrition in a systematic way, not going to find that out. So it's really isn't necessarily okay. So I'd like to thank Anthony again. Really kind of you to that. It's not easy circumstances. So great for that. I'd thank Lucy and Sarah behind the scenes for their effort in the preparation of technology, and Hannah for gathering a lot of these samples and together the outputs as well. So I'm going to hand over now to you guys. Any questions that you've got, hopefully we'll be able to answer. We've got some other vets from Church and Lancashire, so they might be able to help us with answers as well. We'll hand you back over to main hub and get some questions if you have any. So thanks for joining.
Just to reiterate, Dan's points is basically a massive thank you. Firstly to Ant for joining us this evening, and Ed and staff at Reese Heath for their input and support for tonight's event. Thank you to Sarah, Lucy and Michelle at LLM and the other vets that have joined us tonight for the support and ready to field any questions, and for all of the fab behind the scenes effort, and of course to Dan for doing an absolutely great job presenting. Whilst we've got you, we'd just like to mention the launch of our Flock Health scheme. So alongside the Flock Health meetings, of this being the first one, which we're aiming to host a few times a year, we are launching a Flock Health scheme. So this is entailing a monthly subscription fee, but by doing this, we basically were aiming to help maximise your flock production and health while spreading the costs across the year with this monthly subscription fee. But by being part of the scheme, it gives you 2 hours of vet time per year for proactive flock health planning, but specifics of what you would spend this time on can be decided with your vet. It also gives you worm egg count vouchers for worm egg counts to help with all those all-important worming decisions. And there will also be exclusive offers and discounts, such as subsidised blood testing for the tests we discussed earlier on in this presentation. These offers and discounts will change throughout the year, so definitely get in touch with the office if you'd be interested in joining our new Flock Health scheme. There's also a limited number of free lambing kits for those who sign up, but they're first come, first served. But if you'd be interested, we think it's going to be a great thing to be involved with. So please do get in touch with the office. We are now going to try and head back to Dan and Ant for questions. I think
So if you guys can hear, we've had a question about the cost of the scheme. We can definitely discuss that with you guys. So what we're planning on doing in terms of future meetings. So in the past, there was a monthly subscription for the meetings. We're not doing that in the future. We're going to do more sporadic meetings. If we can get support for them and subsidy for them, brilliant. But the health scheme that Hannah just talked about, it's slightly dependent on area because there's an element of different involvement. But I know at Whitchurch, ours is £30 a month. And for that, you get the 2 hours of vet time on the proactive stuff and some big leg count vouchers and then subsidised schemes and things like that. Now, actually, that is a slightly subsidised discounted rate on the hourly stuff, and the fecal egg counts are almost on top of that as a bit of a bonus. So we like to see it as time you'd be spending anyway, just in a proactive way, and you get to spread the cost over 12 months. So hopefully that answers a question. But in terms of Bakewell and Lancs, it'd be worth having a chat with those guys because their schemes are slight variations on ours. I can only speak with authority on which. Okay, so the question for you guys that didn't hear it is, when are the best times to test for minerals in the flock? So we have tested here at 2 different groups of animals and 2 different points. So we've tested grazing lambs to get an idea of what they were doing, and we tested those sort of mid to late grazing season. And then we tested ewes as they came in. Now, when do your ewes come in? At 6 weeks pre?
It's ideally 6 weeks pre, but this year triplets came in a little bit early.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's adding 6 weeks.
Yeah, so I would say that's a good time to do it. It works quite nicely here when they're in 6 weeks pre. If you do it too early, you're not reflective of the diet they're on. If you do it too late, you don't have the opportunity to manipulate the time. And then you have those different ways of manipulation and supplementation. certain boluses that we rate very highly. Not all boluses are the same. We'll talk about that. And then, of course, there's mineral supplementation like mineral part of TMR or mineralized concentrate. And we'd work with the nutritionist or your corn firm on those sorts of things. Potentially. The risk, I always think we're doing it then. I mean, the other thing, of course, is pre-tupping. That's a valid point. And the sort of pre-tupping, again, if you work on the assumption that you need 4 to 6 weeks to manipulate minerals, roughly, then that sort of gives you an idea. Around late on the stage. Sorry, Hannah. When and what do you use antioxidants?
No, we use Hexabac Plus.
Yeah.
4 weeks.
Yeah, and then do you use any abortion vaccination as well?
We haven't this year.
Okay. So Toxo and Enzo would be our classic abortion vaccinations. It's always worth getting in touch with us because different pharmaceutical companies kindly support Baron U blood sampling, so we can get an idea of whether there's Toxo or Enzo antibodies in your block in vaccination, particularly in those of Baron. That's I think by the sound of it, that looks like it's it for questions. I've got a question for Anthony. What you've learned up to this point, not just tonight, but in the build up to this lambing, we haven't started yet. What would you do differently to this point next year? Are there any areas you find?
I think I'd want more rations.
Okay.
I think I'd want very specific rations for the specific animal sense. At the moment, we're feeding 2 rations. I think I'd like to do 3, 4 rations, but it's all limited by our equipment. So big,
yeah.
Yeah. Other than that, that's a big thing.
So a bit more specific in terms of the feeding. Yeah. Good feedback. Where? So the CEDAR protocol, and this is, I have to make sure I get this right, top of my head is a 12-day insertion period with PMSG on withdrawal. The PMSG is dependent on breed and the time of year. So that's always worth talking to us about. So it differs from sponges in that it's a slightly shorter insertion time, and when the brands go in, it's slightly well by that. But yeah, you certainly see.
Yeah.
None.
We don't top dress because we've got blend in the ration. Because we're a TMR ration, we don't top dress at all, so it's always in there. Which helps to, it's like healthy for the use essentially.
Yeah.
You're not going to get acidosis, you're not going to get fighting, you're not going to get crowded at the barrier. It is a lot better if you do it. But yeah, we've got a blend specified based off our grass and maize. They've tailored that blend to what our ewes need at certain times. I don't think we said before, but we'll scale that blend up every week towards lambing. So by the end of lambing, there'll be a lot more blend than it won't start. Initially, when they come in the shed, they won't even touch blend, and we'll just get used to the forage rations to begin with, just make the rumen adapt. Yeah, we don't top dress because for that reason we've already said.
Yeah, so we have the benefit of TMR, but we've seen tonight, even with a TMR, wellness TMR, there's still different feeding, isn't there? Different ewes are getting different things, and the rumen boluses from experimental perspective. And it'd be interesting to see on ewes fed at TMR, what do individual ewes rumen pHs do throughout the day? And I bet you would see a bit of variation.
Yeah. Especially if you turn up in the morning as well and push feed up, you still get a little bit of that crowd. Yeah, we also chop the straw as well. If you see our straw's a little bit bad, just to try and make intakes go through a bit better.
Yeah, so we can see there is a bit of chopping there. And one thing we didn't talk about in a great deal is visual assessment of the ration. So to have a look at it, how open does it look? What sort of smell is there associated with it? What is the forage like? What has the mixer wagon done to it? So has the mixer wagon chopped it? And some mixer wagons are better at chopping than others. There's a little bit of fray in there. So actually you'll see sometimes with straw and often with sort of smaller amounts of straw, you might get it smashed up rather than being chopped. But the longer we leave it, the better they're able to sort it. So some degree of shortening that is beneficial.
Ideally, grind it, but it's not always feasible and profitable to actually do that. So yeah.
Okay, so a question there about getting a refractometer. We sell refractometers, so I think in the region of 25, 27 pounds, that sort of magnitude. People often see them, think they're going to be horrendously expensive, and they're actually not at all. So it's well worth having. Well worth. Any other questions, Hannah? Okay. So we'd really appreciate your feedback. This has been something new for us. Obviously, it's been forced slightly by the restrictions on us, but we'd be really interested to know how you felt it went, what we could do better, what other subjects you would like to see as well. And that goes for future talks in general. Hopefully, if things get back to a bit more normal, we can look at some other talks, maybe get some farm walks in the summer going. So if you can keep that information coming to us, then we can deliver what you guys want. So please keep the feedback coming. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for your patience with respect to our technical challenges and our sound issues at times. And we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.